Hello and welcome to episode number 1 in the PBR Painter project-based tutorial series. In this video we're going to be texturing this Viking shield, and I'll go through all the steps that are required to make a material like this. If you want to follow along with this video exactly, I'll put a link in the description where you can download this shield. I'll also put links to any textures that I use and anything else that you need to recreate this material exactly. And as a final note, I'll be working in Eevee render engine. Alright, so let's make a start. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new material, and I'm going to call that one Shield 2. And I'm just going to recreate that material from scratch. Alright, so first thing you need to do when you have a new material is click Setup for PBR Painter. And that will just get the material ready for the add-on. So I don't need to back up the material, so I'm going to untick that one and click OK. Now when I do this, there's going to be a message down the bottom, and that's going to say that there's no UV map for the model, and therefore it's been unwrapped automatically, which is what it says down here. So it's applied a smart UV project. Basically, I didn't show it in the video, but I deleted the UV map for this model just to show you what will happen if you don't unwrap your mesh prior to starting PBR Painter. Essentially what that did is it automatically unwrapped the mesh so that you can at least use the add-on. Okay, so I'm going to add my first layer now, and that's going to be a wood layer. So this is going to be the wood backing on the shield. And in order to add that wood material, I'm going to use the multi-texture import button, which is this one here, which lets me basically just identify my material, which is in this folder here, and I can just select the textures, click import, and it will automatically assign them to the correct channels, and it will turn those channels on and have that material ready to go. So if I click refresh material, as you can see, it's now applied that material to the model. So it's going to use UV mapping by default. I want to use box mapping, so I'm going to click box, and then again click refresh, and now it's using box mapping. The other thing I want to change with my material is I want to make it a little bit darker. So I'm going to go under the base color settings. I'm going to turn on adjust HSV, and again I have to click refresh material when I do that. If you're wondering about this refresh material button, basically what it does is it lets you control when to compile the shader. In previous versions of the add-on that didn't exist, which meant that every time you made a small change in any of these channels, you had to sit there and wait for the shader to compile, which, if you have complicated materials, can take a while. So this button is there to basically let you decide when you want to refresh and to ultimately save you a lot of time. But anyway, back to the material. So what I want to do is I want to basically make this a little bit darker. So I'm going to go into the HSV, so the hue, saturation, and value. And the value is going to basically change the brightness of that texture. So I'm going to drop that, and it makes it a little bit darker like that, which is more of the color that I want to go for. Alright, the next thing I want to do before I go on to the next layer is I want to make this a little bit less shiny, because I want to make it kind of a bit more dull and a little bit more worn looking. So I'm going to close the base color settings and go into the roughness channel. And under the roughness settings, I can go to the roughness color ramp. And if I just select this bottom point down here, I can increase the brightness of this point, and that will just increase the overall roughness and make it look a little bit duller. So I think something like that looks good. And I think that's everything for this layer. So that's my wood layer. Next layer I want to add is the metal around the edges and also in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer called metal. Click OK. And once again, I'm going to import textures. So again, just navigating to the correct folder. So I've organized all my textures in here just for the convenience of the video. So again, selecting the textures that I want, clicking import, and it just assigns them automatically ready to go. So before I click refresh, I'm just going to change the mapping in advance to box, and then now clicking refresh, and now it's applied that metal material to the entire model. Now it looks like it kind of got rid of the wood, and that's just because this layer is sitting on top of the wood. But if I reduce the opacity of this layer, you can see that the wood is still there. It's just being hidden by this current layer. So what I need to do is I need to tell this layer to only apply the metal in the middle, on the bolts, and also around the edges. The best way to do that is with something called an ID map. And you can locate the ID map settings up here, and you just need to turn that on, and that gives you access to the ID map. If you've never used an ID map before, what it does is it basically allows you to segment your model using different colors as a kind of quick and easy way to mask your different layers. So I'm going to demonstrate that now. So I'm going to use the vertex color mode for my ID map, and that's going to let me create one from scratch. So if I just click create new, that will put me into the preview mode for the ID map. And as you can see, by default, it's just a blank map. And now what I need to do is assign colors to different parts of the model to segment the model. The best way to do that is to press tab and do it through edit mode. So if I just deselect for a start, I'm going to swap across to face select, which is up here, or you can press number 3. And that's going to let me select individual faces, which I can then apply a certain color to. What I want to do then is decide where I want to apply different colors to segment this model. So for a start, I know that this part of the model is supposed to be wood, so that should be one color. So I can go ahead and collect the faces like this, or I can press L, and that will select all of the linked faces. The reason that worked is because this is actually a disconnected mesh. So if I just move this up, you can see this is actually a separate part. So that's the reason why L worked in that case. So now that I've selected that one, I can look at the bottom and do the same thing on the bottom. And now I've basically got all of my wood selected. Once I've done that, I need to assign a color, and I can do that with this button over here. So I'm going to leave this color as it is and click OK. And now it's just assigned a color to the wood on the model. Now I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to grab the handle with L once again, and I'm going to assign a different color to the handle. Okay, so now that that's done, the rest of the model is metal, so it's the bolts plus the rest of the metal, and I'm going to just do that all as one material to make things nice and simple. Now I don't have to actually go and select all of those individually because it's already a color, so I can just use that white color as part of my ID map. Okay, so now that I've made my ID map, that will be then saved, and I can use that in every layer from now on. So I'm going to press tab to go out of edit mode. Next thing I need to do is I need to tell this particular layer which part of the model to be applied to. And you do that by selecting the ID color. So you click this little color here, click the eyedropper, and then just select the part of the model that you want that layer to apply to. So in this case, I want it to apply to this white metal. So when I turn that preview off, what happens is it now applies the metal just to those parts of the model. So as you can see, ID maps are very critical for this kind of quick masking of your different layers. Alright, so now that that's set up, the last thing I want to do in this layer, if I zoom into the middle, you'll notice that there are seams in this bit here. The reason for that is the box mapping is basically projecting the textures from different directions. So at the intersection between those axes, you get this ugly seam. The way to fix that is just to increase the seam blend in the mapping, and that will blur those seams together. Usually something about 0.3 works pretty well. And that's it. So I'm pretty happy with that as a layer. One thing I might do is just increase the scale slightly. Alright, so that's done. Now I'm going to add a new layer, and I'm going to add a material for the handle. So I'm going to go through the exact same process. So again, picking the textures. And once again, changing it to box mapping. And finally, turning on an ID map. And you'll see that now that I've set up this ID map, when I go and preview this ID map in this layer, it's exactly the same as the one that I made earlier. So now I can just go into the ID color, select the handle, stop the preview, and if we just rotate this 180 degrees, you'll see that it's now applied the wood handle material to this part of the model. Alright, so one thing you can see is that it actually appears to be incorrectly rotated. So we can fix that using PBR Painter's box mapping system. So the box mapping system used in the add-on is actually different to the box mapping in Blender in that you can independently rotate the different axes without it affecting the other axes. So you can't do that by default, but you can do it because of how it's done in PBR Painter. So that's really handy because then you can just rotate these individual axes and you can fix those problems without any extra mucking around. So as you can see now, that's the correct orientation, and I think I'm pretty happy with that material, so I'm going to leave it as it is, put this back up, and I'm then ready to go ahead and add a new layer. Okay, so now that I've added my 3 base materials, everything on the model is covered by a material, so at this point it's kind of time to start thinking about what details to add to the model. And the first thing that I'd like to add are bumps across the model because it's looking very kind of smooth, and I want to add some sort of bumps that make it a little bit less perfect looking. So I'm going to add a new layer once again, and I'm just going to call this one bumps, and I'm going to make this one a painted layer, and this will set up the layer for hand painting details, which is exactly what I want to do this bumping. And I'm going to make it 4K, and I'll turn on 32-bit float, which is generally recommended when you're doing normal painting or bump painting. So clicking OK. Alright, so when you add a painted layer, you'll notice that you automatically get a color associated with that layer, but I don't actually want the color, so I'm going to turn that one off. What I do want are the normals, and I'm going to turn that on. And I just want to turn on layer bumping, because that will automatically bump where I paint. The final thing I want to switch on is the combine normals, because that will make sure that when I paint on my bumps, I don't mask the underlying normals of the wood or of the metal on the sides. When I turn on combine normals, it will make sure that it just combines whatever I paint with whatever is underneath. So with all of that set up, I'm going to click refresh. And nothing's happened because I haven't painted yet, but it should be pretty much set up to paint. So let's have a go. So putting the strength up to full. Okay, so it's kind of working as expected. It's making a bump. However, there are a couple of problems. So for a start, it obviously doesn't look very good because I'm just using a straight brush. Also, the bumping is happening in the wrong direction. So it's bumping up, whereas I want it to bump down. So I'm just going to undo that. And the way you get it to bump down is you just invert the bump color ramp. So now if we paint that, as you can see, it's now denting the wood. Alright, so the next thing I want to do is I want to set up the brush so that it looks a little bit more realistic. I don't want to just paint these bumps like that because that looks a bit stupid. I want to kind of paint with a random brush. So to do that, I'm going to take advantage of the brush mask over here. Before I change any of the settings in here, I'm going to create a brand new brush, and I'm going to call this one bumps. The reason I'm making a new brush is because later on, if I want to come back to these bumps, it's very handy to have a different brush rather than having to set up the brush settings every single time. Okay, so now that I've got that set up, I'm going to look at the brush mask, and I'm going to create a new texture. And I'm just going to call this one bumps. Now for the mapping, random is good because that will randomly apply the bumps. And the type, I want to change that from image or movie to clouds. And that's going to give me a cloud texture, which is basically a noise texture, which is then going to define the brush mask. So if I just click that one on, as you can see, it's now applying the clouds as a mask to the brush. That looks a little bit too small, so I'm going to increase the size for a start, just to kind of make these bigger bumps. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Shift and F, and I'm going to bring the strength all the way down because I want to make this very, very subtle. So now that all that's set up, if I try that, as you can see, it's now very subtly just bumping on the wood like that. So that's the kind of effect that I wanted to get. So I'm going to go around the edges and just kind of bump the wood a little bit, just to add a little bit more interesting variation in the surface, rather than having a kind of perfectly smooth wood. So I think that's fine like that for a start. Next thing I want to do is I want to bump up the metal a little bit. So I'm going to put this down slightly, and I'm just going to add some bumps in the center of this metal. And as you can see, it now looks like it's kind of dinting on the metal a little bit. So I think that looks pretty good. Remember, you can always adjust the bump strength later on, so you don't have to worry too much if you go too strong with this. As long as the overall effect is right, you can always adjust that later on. So I think that looks pretty good for the middle. Now what I'm going to do is just go around the edges and do the same thing along the edges. Very, very slightly. I'm not going to overdo it. It's very easy to overdo this kind of thing. So I'm just going to do a few bumps here and there in a way that doesn't look too unrealistic. Maybe changing the size as well. And I think something like that is fine. So again, not over the top, just enough to kind of see a slight bumping on the shield edges. And I think I'm going to leave it there for the layer. So I'm happy with how that looks. So what I'm going to add next are some scratches, and the scratches are going to go along the wood. So I'm going to add a new layer and call this one wood scratches. And I'm going to change it back to filled and click OK. Okay, so in order to generate my scratches, I'm going to use a layer mask. And the mask that I'm going to use is the preset mask called Scratches. And that's going to generate procedural scratches across the model to use to kind of scratch and gouge out the wood. So let's click OK. And I'm going to click Preview Mask. And as you can see, this is the procedural effect generated by that mask. So I'm going to change the length a little bit. I'm going to drop it down to make it kind of short little scratches like that. And I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to leave the thickness the same, and I'm just going to leave the rest of that as it is. Now, in order to limit the number of procedural things going on, I'm just going to bake this mask, and that way it's going to save a lot of resources in terms of the computation. So I'm going to click the bake button, and I'm just going to bake it to a 4K texture, and it will bake it exactly as it appears on the model. And I'm just going to skip this in the video, and I'll come back when the baking's finished. Okay, so that mask has been baked, and it's now added as an image texture, and as you can see, it's the same effect, but in the form of a baked texture. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is actually set up this layer in order to do that scratching. So I've got my mask ready, but I've got no channels turned on. So the obvious channel to turn on first is the normals, because that's going to basically make that gouging effect. And I'm just going to stop previewing the mask while I do this. And basically what I want to do with the normal is exactly as I did before and turn on layer bumping. And when I do that, as you can see, it now looks like there are these scratches along the model. However, as before, it looks like these scratches are going up, so I need to invert the colors in here, and that will make sure that the scratches go down like that. Alright, next thing I want to do is I only want to apply these scratches to the wood. So I'm going to hide the masks, go back to the ID map, and then just select the wood. And now it's just applying it to the wood. However, if I rotate the model 180 degrees, I would also like to apply the scratches to the handle. So I can do that by simply adding an extra ID color. So again, if I preview this, I can then click Add ID Color, click this color here, and then just select the handle. And as you can see, it's now applying the scratches correctly to the handle as well. Okay, so I'm going to want to add some more scratches to that because I don't think it's quite enough, but I'm not going to do that just yet. The reason for that is that I want to add some paint to my metal bits and also to the handle, and I want the paint to be scratched in the exact same way that the wood is being scratched. So in order to do that, I'm going to need a separate layer for the paint, but I'm going to have to share the masks between the two layers, and I'm going to demonstrate exactly how to do that now. So first of all, I'll add a new layer and call this one black paint, and it's going to be a black paint that I add to those different parts of the model. So for this one, I'm going to make it very simple, and I'm just going to turn on a constant color and make it black. I'm going to give it a constant metallic of 0. I'm going to give it a constant roughness of something kind of average. And for now, I'm just going to leave the normals off, but I'll turn them on later on. Next thing I want to do is I want to select the part of the model to apply the paint. So I want to put it on the metal. And I also want to put it on the handle. So again, adding an extra color and just selecting the handle as well. So once I do all of that, if I turn this off, as you can see, it's now applied a simple metal paint to the metal, a black paint to the metal, and also to the handle on the back. Okay, so now that I've done that, as I said, I want the scratches from the wood layer to also appear in the metal layer. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the layer masks, and I'm going to go add new mask, and I'm going to select layer. Basically, layer means that I will get the masks from any of these other layers, and I'll run those masks directly into the current layer. If I select the wood scratches layer and click OK, and then I preview that mask, what you can see is it's now exactly the same as the mask from the wood scratches layer. In addition to that, anytime I change the masks in here, it will automatically update in here. So these are now permanently linked, which is a very useful thing to be able to do. Okay, so now that I've done that, I'm going to turn off the mask. And what you'll notice is that it looks like it's actually gotten rid of the paint completely, but what it's actually done is it's masked everything except the scratches. So it's now applying paint as scratches. To fix that, all I need to do is open up the color ramps and invert one of these color ramps. This color ramp is associated with this mask, and this color ramp is associated with the mask stack. So when I add multiple masks, this color ramp is associated with everything. So I'm going to use this one, and that'll become clear why I do that later on. So when I do that, as you can see, it's now correctly inverted the mask, and it's now applying the scratches in the paint. And if you want to change how those scratches look, you can just adjust the color ramp and bring that up or bring this one down to get whatever effect you want. So I think something like that's pretty good for a start. All right, now that I've added those scratches, now I'm going to turn on the normals, and I'm going to use the normals to bump the layer. So again, clicking on Combine Normals and Layer Bump. This is going to basically bump the paint around the scratches. So if we refresh now, as you can see, the normals are now bumping the layer where the scratches are. So at the moment, it looks way too intense. So what I'm going to do is bring this color ramp in. That will bring the intensity down a little bit. But I'll also reduce the bump strength. So generally, you don't want to go very high with something like this because obviously the paint is very thin, so it shouldn't be very obvious. So something like that's probably pretty good. Okay. The next thing I want to do to my paint is I want to add some edge wear. So I want the paint to kind of peel away from the edges, and also on top of the bolts, I want that to be kind of peeled away because that will add a very realistic effect to the paint. So to do that, I'm going to add a new mask, and again, I'm going to use a preset, and in this case, I'm going to select the edge wear. So when I do that, you'll notice that it says cycles, and this means that it needs cycles in order to work properly. But as I'll demonstrate, we can just bake that for Eevee as well. So adding that mask, I'm going to click Preview for this mask. And as you can see, you can't see anything, and that's because we need to swap across to cycles just to view this mask. So the preset edgeware mask works very well, as you can see, and generally you shouldn't need to do a lot more. If it doesn't look great for your model, you can consider changing the edge detect method. And basically different methods will work better or worse for different models. It's just a matter of trial and error. But in this case, the curvature works very well. The one thing I'm going to change is I'm going to adjust the curvature color ramp just to kind of bring it in a little bit from the edges like that. So I think something like that looks quite good. And I'm not going to do anything else to that mask. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bake it, and then I can use that back in Eevee. So again, I'm going to skip this in the video and come back when the baking's finished. Alright, so that one's baked, and now we can go back into Eevee. And now you can see we have this nice edgeware mask, perfectly suited for the paint, and available in Eevee. So once I've done that, what I'm going to do next is go and look at the mask stack, and this will look at the combination of the edgeware and the scratches. Now you remember earlier I mentioned that I could have changed either of these color ramps. Now you can kind of see why I changed the stack, because now that we have two masks in here, it's now really nicely taken up that edgeware mask and applied the same color ramp and given these nice sharp edges. So I don't really need to do anything else with that. So let's have a look now and see how that looks. So that looks pretty good. One thing I will do is I will change this from mix to add. And basically that's going to add the edgeware instead of mixing it together with the scratches. And I'll just pull that up full so we get maximum edgeware. So now that looks quite good. Let's just have a look at the back. So it's also applied that to the handle, and it looks pretty good, maybe a little bit over the top. So what I can actually do now that I've set up this final color ramp like this, I can just leave it, and I can just adjust the edgeware on its own. So I can pull this color ramp in, and as you can see, it doesn't affect the scratches, it only affects the edgeware mask. So I think something like that might look a bit nicer. And again, if we put that back around, I think that looks pretty good. I might also bring in the scratches a bit. I think they look a little bit too intense. And again, if we rotate that round, I think it looks a little bit better like that. I think they were a bit too fat looking, and I think that looks a bit nicer. Now you remember I said earlier that I want to add more scratches, so I'm going to do that in a minute. In fact, I might actually do that now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my wood scratches layer, And I want to add more scratches in here so that they automatically get passed through this layer and into the paint layer as well. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to actually hand paint the scratches onto this baked texture. So that's another advantage of baking the texture, in the sense that you can just directly paint onto that texture. Bear in mind that is a destructive approach, so you won't be able to kind of undo your changes when you do that. So let's go through that process now. So the first thing I need to do is click paint, and that's going to let me paint onto this texture. So if I now click the preview mask button and I just start painting, what it's doing is it's just directly painting onto that texture. Obviously I don't want to do that. I want to actually hand paint some scratches onto this scratches texture. And I'm just putting the strength up now. To do that, what I'm going to do is a different type of brush mask. So again, I'm going to add a new brush and call this one Scratches, just so I can come back to it later. And again, I'm going to use a brush mask. However, this time I'm going to add a new texture and call this one Scratches. And in this case, I'm going to leave this one as Image or Movie. And I'm going to keep the mapping at random. And for the image, I'm going to import a Scratches texture. And again, I'll put a link to that one in the description. So clicking open, I've got that one ready to go in here. So now that I've got that, I can directly paint that on using that as a mask. However, if I have a look at this brush, when I zoom in like this, you'll notice that it's kind of very, very fine, that mask. So it's going to be a little bit too fine for the scratches that I want to paint. So what I want to do is I want to actually change the mapping of that one. So I can do that under mask mapping. And all I need to do is just basically put this size down. So I'm going to put something like 0.1. So this is an inverse scale. So if you go smaller, you generally get a bigger size mask. So now it kind of looks a bit thicker. So now if I paint that on, what you'll see is it's now nicely painting on these scratches on the model. So I could go ahead and paint that across with this view, but I prefer to turn off the preview. And that's going to give me kind of live feedback while I'm painting. So I'll be able to see the effects directly on the material. So for example, if I now start painting on the wood, what you can see is it's now applying these scratches directly onto the wood, and I can see that happening in real time. So now it's just a matter of going through my model and doing this painting. And as you can see from that one, it's now painting a scratch into the paint, which is then running into a gouge in the wood. So that's all happening because the masks are connected and the effect is handled by these two different layers. So that's generally a very powerful setup because you can get these really realistic effects where you have this kind of continuity of the scratches between these different parts of the material. And so with that now set up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed up the video and I'm just going to go around and start painting on scratches across the model. As I'm doing this, I'm noticing it's not particularly obvious in the wood. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the mask multiplier for the normals, and that's going to bring it out in the wood, as we can see like that. And as I do that, I've just noticed I didn't turn on combine normals, so I really should do that for the wood scratches. And again, just hitting refresh. So now that that's set up properly, I can keep going with that painting. And again, I'll speed up the video for this. Alright, so I'm going to leave it there. If you get to this point and you think you've kind of overdone it a little bit, remember that you can always adjust the color ramps in these different layers. So for example, if I just pull this color ramp in, I can adjust all of the scratches in one go. So I can bring the whole thing back. Another way you can do it is if you just want to, say, do it on the paint, you can just pull in this color ramp and you can just adjust the scratches on the paint itself. So you have a lot of control over the different parts of your material. So I think I might bring that in a little bit, and I might bring it in a little bit on the wood as well, just by bringing in this multiplier. So again, this is another thing you can do. So I'm just changing this mask multiplier, And that's just kind of dulling the normals a little bit because I think they were a little bit too intense on that normal channel. Alright, so I think I might leave it there for now. Again, I can come back and change that if I want to later because I have this brush saved in here. But I might go ahead and move on to the next layer so that I'm not taking up too much time. Next thing I want to add is a logo. So you'll remember at the start of the video there was a nice PBR Painter logo in the center of the shield. So I'm going to do that now, and the way I'm going to do that is with another painted layer. So this one's going to be called Logo, and I'm going to make it a painted layer, and again just set it at 4K. I don't need 32-bit float because I won't be painting any strong normals. So clicking OK. So now that I've done that, in this case I do want to use a color, so I'm going to leave that one on for now. And what I want to do is I want to set up the brush in here so that it's doing this nice decal painting. So once again I'm going to make a new brush, and this one I'm going to call Logo. And underneath the brush mask, I'm going to leave this mostly the same, except I'm going to change the image in here. And for this one, I'm going to click Open, and I'm going to select this PBR Painter logo that I have already saved here. The other thing I'm going to change is I'm going to change the mapping from random to stencil, and that's going to let me stencil paint that on. Now you'll notice that I can't really see anything in here. The reason for that is I still have the mask mapping set very, very low in here for the size. So I'm going to put that back to 1, and that will give me my logo like that. Now I can move that brush mask using Alt and right click, and I can resize with Alt Shift right click, and if you want to you can rotate with Control Alt and right click like that. If you rotate it and then later on you say want to go back to the start, you can go under mask mapping and you can change this angle in here down to 0. The other thing you can do with the mask mapping is you can change the aspect ratio. So in this case, I might put the Y up a little bit, and that's going to kind of shrink the Y down, just to kind of change the aspect ratio like that. When you do that, you may notice that you get the repeat of that coming in at the edges. If you don't want that, you can just go under image mapping and change this from repeat to clip. Now you just have the one image. So with all of that set up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click refresh material. And now I'm basically ready to paint that on. So I'm going to press 7 on the numpad and just basically line that up now from the vertical direction. So making it a little bit bigger. I think something like that looks fine. And I'm just going to paint it on like that. So at the moment it's painting on with white. And that's because I have painted selected in here. So painted means whatever the brush is, that's what color it's going to add. So you can change the color and paint different parts to different colors if you want. But for the sake of this, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change that to constant, because I just want to make this a constant color. And refreshing once more. And now I just need to adjust that to the correct color. So I'm going to make it like a really dark blue, something like that. And I think I'll leave it like that. Okay, so now I've painted that on. I'm just going to get rid of this mask, just so it's not kind of hanging around in the way. Next thing I want to do is I want to use the ID map to only assign it to the wood. So just selecting that wood section. And now it's no longer on the metal. Okay, so next thing I want to do is I want to look closely, and you'll notice that there's scratches going through the paint, but the paint is kind of intact. So that doesn't look very good because it looks like it's almost been painted over the scratches after it's been scratched. So what I want to actually do is apply a similar effect that I did in here and actually make these scratches wear away at the paint. So to do that, what I'm going to do is add a layer mask, and once again, by the way, you'll notice for a painted layer you have this locked mask in here, which is what lets you do this kind of painting automatically. But I'm just going to add a layer mask once again, and once again I'm going to select the scratches because I'm going to use those scratches to mask this decal. So again I'm going to look at this mask with the preview, and when I do that you'll notice that it's basically masking where the scratches are. So I actually want to flip that color around because I want the same effect as I had in the paint. And now when I preview the stack, What it's doing is it's masking based on the decal that I painted, but it's also masking now based on this scratching effect. So if I just close down this preview now, all I need to do at this point is then adjust this color ramp and I can really fine tune that effect. So you'll see when I pull this one up, what it's now doing is it's now around the scratches, it's now degrading the paint, which I think looks quite nice because it's a very realistic looking effect and it looks like the scratches are actually peeling off that paint, which you can see quite clearly in here. So I think that looks really good. In saying that, I still think it looks a little bit too sharp and clear everywhere where the scratches aren't. So what I'm going to do is add one more mask, and this is going to be a procedural mask. And I'm just going to use this to add some kind of random noise to the rest of the decal. So again, previewing the mask. And I'm just going to change the settings in here and make it a bit rougher so I can increase the detail and the roughness. And I'm just going to pull in the color ramp to make it a bit patchy. And with that like that, what I'm going to do is jump back to the stack. And now I can have a look at the final effect. So the last thing I'll do now is play around with this mask stack color ramp, and that will let me basically combine all of those different effects to really wear down the overall decal. So that looks pretty good. I think I will have a look and see how that looks on the material. Maybe a little bit too much, so I can bring that back a little bit. And I think something like that looks pretty good. So just a little bit more worn than it was before. Alright, so now that I'm happy with that, the last thing I need to do in this layer is I need to adjust the other channels. So at the moment, it has the correct color for the decal. However, if we look in the light, you'll notice that it doesn't really contrast with the wood. And that's because the roughness is not turned on and neither are the normals. So first thing I'll do is I'll turn on those two channels. For the roughness, I will make it something similar to the paint on the metal. And for the normals, I will again combine normals. And again, I'll turn on a layer bump. Now I'm going to refresh and the normals will look weird at the start, but I'll adjust that in a minute. Alright, so as I said, the normals look way over the top and weird, so I'm going to change that for a start. So first thing I'll do is I'll bring the strength all the way down to almost 0. Just so that it's very, very slightly bumping out of the surface. So you can see that that at 0.1 looks pretty good. And you can see the difference of nothing versus 0.1. It's very subtle, but it does add an effect. Now, in terms of the roughness, you can see again that the reflectiveness is now different. So it's reflecting the light because it's a little bit more glossy than the wood, and that adds a lot in terms of making it look a little bit more like paint. I think the normals might actually be a bit too high, so I'm going to put that at something like that, just to kind of bring it down a bit. You can always obviously just get rid of the normals if you want to, but I think a little bit looks okay. I might actually increase the roughness slightly to something like that. Now, the other thing you can do that's really interesting with the normals, when you're combining normals, you can actually change the strength of the underlying normals. So if we zoom in on a region with a bit of paint, like this bit here, if I now adjust this, what you'll notice is that the normals underneath the paint actually get smoothed out. So that's not overly obvious when it's really faded like this, but if you're painting something on, you may want to do that because it kind of looks like the paint is sort of thick on the surface, and therefore it's kind of masking the normals a little bit. So if we look at this region over here, we compare a value of 1 versus something like 0.3. You can see that that really masks those underlying normals, and you can have fine control over that with this slider. So that's another really handy thing to be able to change. And again, it's subtle, but the combination of these effects really do add up to create a very nice overall effect. Okay, so that's how it looks after modifying those channels. And with that, we're almost there. So we've got one more layer. So the last thing I'm going to add is a little bit of dirt and grunge. And I'm going to do that in such a way that it kind of adds the dirt and the grunge into the crevices of the model, rather than just kind of adding it randomly over the whole thing. So first thing I'll do is I'll add a new layer called dirt. and click OK. And first thing I'm going to do in this layer is I'm going to set up the masks. So for this one, in order to target the crevices, once again, I'll be using a preset, and this one is the grunge mask. And again, it's asking for cycles, so I'm going to press OK, and I'm going to swap to cycles. And I'm just going to preview that one. So as you can see, it's picking up the crevices and it's kind of highlighting those. In addition to that, it's actually applying a noise texture in the crevices, which is kind of the whole point of this mask in the sense that it creates this kind of instant grunge effect. So I don't have to do too much to that because it's basically set up as it is. I may want to increase the contrast slightly. One really important thing that I will do with this is I'm going to tick the box that says generate AO from normals. And what that's going to do, as I'll demonstrate, is it will now calculate the mask using all of the normals from the previous layers. So not just the ambient occlusion from the model, but also the crevices from every single previous layer. And as you can see, when I do that, it's now picking up all these crevices in the wood and also some of the crevices from those scratches. So that's really cool, and again, is going to add so much to the overall realism of the model. So we can have a quick look at the bottom as well, and as you can see, it's done very nicely in terms of finding those crevices. It's fairly intense inside there, but we can have a look at that later after we bake it. So I'm going to bake this so that I can then use it again in Eevee. So again, I'm going to bake it at 4K, and I will skip it in the video, and I'll be back in a second after the baking. Alright, so that baking's finished, and now we have, once again, our baked mask ready to go in Eevee. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off and I'm going to set up the channels for this layer. So obviously I want to add a color to the dirt, and I'm just going to make it some kind of dark brown color. And I'll add a roughness because I want it to be fairly rough. I'll also add metallic because I want it to have a 0 metallic, so when it does appear on the metal, I want it to be 0 rather than just whatever the metal is. And I'll also add a normal and again give it a combined normals and a constant bump. So that's just going to make sure that the dirt kind of bumps out of the surface a bit. So with all of that set up, I'm going to refresh and see how it looks. And can't really tell at the moment how it looks because it's very subtle. So what I'm going to do is, you can kind of see it in the very, very subtly in the crevices down here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the different channels and I'm going to increase the mask multiplier. And that's just going to increase how the mask is being multiplied for each channel. So when I do that, you'll see that it slowly kind of comes out of those crevices. So I think something like that's okay for the color, and I'm going to do the same for these channels. And I think the roughness will make it very obvious. So we can see now from the roughness that we can actually start to see that dirt coming out. And we can have a look at the edges as well. So again, you can see that now on these parts in here. And I'll do the same for the normals, but probably just very, very slightly because, yeah, so that doesn't need much. It's actually probably pretty good where it is. The other thing I can do in the masks is I can increase the brightness of this mask by just changing this color ramp like that. So I might do that a little bit as well. So I think that looks pretty good, and now we can kind of get a sense of the overall impact by just kind of playing around with this opacity. So you can see if we drop that down, there's nothing, and if we add it in, you can see it really adds a kind of layer of dirt in those crevices like that. So I also want to add some dirt across the model, so I'm going to add a second mask, and this is going to be a procedural once again. And again, I'm going to preview that one. And for this one, I'm going to change the settings and maybe leave the scale as it is, but I'm going to increase the detail once again and the roughness just to kind of make it rough. And I'll also change the color ramps to make it a little bit patchy like that. And also I'm going to change the blend because I want it to be added to the final mask, not mixed. So I'll change that to add, and I'll adjust this in a second. So I'll preview the whole thing. And I can adjust this to see how much I want to add to that grunge mask. So I'm going to turn this off and then do it by the final material. So that's obviously way too much dirt. Doesn't look too bad, but it's a bit too intense. So I'll bring that down. Maybe something just like that. although that's probably a little bit too much still, so maybe something like 0.05, 0.04, just enough so you can see it clearly, but it's not kind of overpowering. And now with both of those masks, we can really see the effect. If we drop this down to 0, you can see how much of a difference that makes by adding that dirt on the top. Alright, so the final thing I want to do before I go ahead and do the baking, which is the last part of the video, I just want to have a quick look at the back, because I remember that it looked like it was baking a bit too strong, and as we can see, the grunge mask has baked an excessive amount of grunge in this spot down here. So what I need to do is actually kind of back that off a little bit. And the easiest way to do that now that I've baked my mask is to just go in and hand paint that back. So I need to go across to my dirt mask and find that mask, which is this one, and I'm going to hit paint. Now what I need to do is preview that one, and now I just want to go to black and paint that back until it's much less intense. At this point, it's clear that the handle is actually getting in the way of the painting, so I need a way to actually get rid of that. So to do that, what you need to do is go into edit mode, deselect everything, select the thing you want to hide and press H, and that will get rid of it in edit mode. When you go back into painting mode, however, that will reappear. In order to get that to be hidden during painting mode, what we need to do is select the remaining bit, which is you can do by just pressing A, go back into painting mode, and then turn on this little paint mask tool. And when you do that combination of things, you will get rid of the hidden thing while you're painting. So I'm just going to drop the strength a lot, and I'm just going to dull this back a bit. I still want to have some dirt there because I think it looks quite nice underneath the handle, but it's just way too intense. So I'm going to kind of back this way off in here especially. I can leave a little bit, obviously, because I think a little bit looks nice, but it's just way too intense overall. You can turn this off if you want to have a live update of what you're doing. So as you can see, the dirt actually looks quite good in there, but there's just too much of it. So again, under here, we want to get rid of that. And just kind of back the whole thing off. And I think that looks pretty good like that. All right, so I can press Alt-H, and that will bring everything back. The last thing I want to do is I want to check underneath this one because I want to make sure that it hasn't baked too much underneath this as well. So again, I'm going to go into edit mode. This time I'm going to select the handle and I'm going to press Control-I. Then I'm going to follow the same procedure. So H to hide, select this one, go back out, and then now I can just paint on this one. And I can preview the mask to make it easier to see what I'm doing. So I think something like that looks pretty good. I think there's a stray edge over there, but that doesn't matter. So again, Alt-H, and it will bring the whole thing back. Okay, so now that we've done that, and I can turn off this masking tool, and turn off painting, and turn off the mask, I think that looks a whole lot better now. And I'm pretty happy with how that's turned out. So I'm going to rotate that back to the normal position, and with that, I think I'm going to leave it there. So depending on what I'm doing, I may want to spend more time on something like this. However, for the sake of the video, I don't want to be wasting too much time because I think the main point of the video is to demonstrate the techniques, not to create something perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and move along to the final part of the video, which is the baking. Essentially what we're going to use the baking for today is basically just to take this final product and turn it into a set of textures, which you can then use within Blender, or you can then export them externally to use them in some other program, and various other things like that. So I'm going to go across to the baking tab, and I'm not going to go through this in detail because I have other videos dedicated to baking. Basically, I'm going to leave the resolution at 4K. I'm going to tick save externally, and I'm going to pick that directory. And this is a directory I've set up earlier for this project. So that's going to save all of my baked textures into that directory. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tick this one, and this is going to create a new material when I do the baking, and it's going to put all of those baked textures and embed them into the new material, which I'll demonstrate after I finish the baking. So I can just leave that as create new, and I'm going to tick this thing, and this is basically going to make sure when I make that material, it doesn't disappear when I close Blender. All right, the final thing I want to talk about is it's important to consider how Blender does the baking when you're working in Eevee. So because Blender bakes using cycles, it's important to make sure your materials look right in cycles before you start the baking. Sometimes cycles can look a little bit different than Eevee, so often the normals in Eevee look a little bit more intense, especially for these more kind of intense parts. So you want to go into cycles and actually make sure everything looks right in cycles before you bake it. So in this example, you may want to increase the strength of the scratches, and I'm going to do that by adjusting this mask multiplier in the scratches layer, just to kind of get it looking a little bit better when it's running through Cycles render engine. And that way it will bake a little bit more like that. So with that set up like that, I'm now going to jump across to the baking tab again, and I'm going to click bake. And I'm just going to click OK, and once again I'm going to come back when the baking's finished and just show very quickly the final product. Okay, so that baking is finished, and now I'm going to jump across to that new material that was created, and this one contains all of those baked textures, and as you can see it generally looks almost identical to the original. Obviously there's a slight difference due to the fact that you've lost all the procedurals, but basically the same thing. And if we jump down here into the shader editor, you can see that now what it's done is it's taken those textures and it's put them into this new material, and this material is actually perfectly set up now for exporting. So this is the simplest format for a material in Blender. Basically it is just a base color, metallic, a roughness, and a normal, all feeding into a single principled shader. So this kind of workflow where you take your complicated material and you bake it into something like this is perfect for game assets, because you then have your textures saved externally and also embedded within this material. So that's perfect for different options in terms of exporting and using those textures externally. Alright, so with that I'm going to finish the video because that's everything I wanted to cover. Really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got something from it, and I hope you can apply some of the ideas from this video in your own projects. If you're willing, please feel free to share your projects and your results from PBR Painter in the Discord server. And definitely check out my other videos because I've got tons of other tutorials and other useful hints and tips that'll help you get the most out of the add-on. And subscribe if you haven't already, because I'll be releasing more and more of these kinds of videos in the future. But anyway, that's it for me, so thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll catch you in another one of my videos. Cheers!